Hi, Dr. Alex here, and welcome to number 6 in the top 10 best sword-fighting films of all time. Apologies for the delay in getting this film up. Once again, life has got in the way, as it has a habit of doing. Nothing particularly traumatic or stressful, just the usual everyday work and household nonsense. Not at all interesting. You may have also noticed that the intro was particularly quick today, and this is because the latest film in the series has 11 fight scenes in it, and so I want to try and get through this in a reasonable amount of time, and I'll probably reduce the amount of preamble because of that. However, I've got a bad feeling about this. This will also be the last movie I make in this series for a little while, because I have to finally get around to making the first film in the Marvelous Musical Mayhem series on the Yamaha CP20, because my mum's birthday is fast approaching and I need to give it to her as a present, so it will not be here to play with for very much longer. That said, let's get straight into the film. I'm going to try and work in as much of the side preamble about the plot and the development of the characters into the sword fights themselves, since they do carry through the narrative with quite even spacing in terms of plot points. And so let's get into it. The film is Scaramouche. This is, of course, while not itself a French film, a film which is set in France, which may please my French friends and even frenemies. The film is based on a novel by Raphael Sabatini again, who's the same author behind the novel Captain Blood, and as such it has quite a detailed story, both in terms of historical detail and simply a fairly complex plot with many twists and turns and not insubstantial character development on the part of at least the main central character and supporting characters. Our hero, André Moreau, is played by Stuart Granger, a very talented English lead actor who has starred in other great films, including King Solomon's Mines and The Prisoner of Zenda. There are two leading ladies in this film, both of which have the attentions of our lead character, André Moreau. The first, and to my mind, the most interesting and certainly attractive, both in character and, well, she's pretty darn hot, is Eleanor Parker, playing Lenore.
Lenore, my bride, my beautiful. What have I done to deserve you?
Oh, so far, remarkably little. But I'm living in hopes. Roses.
They're lucky for lovers.
Are they? What a pity they fade so quickly.
These will not fade, my beloved.
Oh, diamonds.
I thought of your eyes, and I went right out and bought them.
Just my eyes? How sweet. I must see you start thinking about all of me.
Second of these is the more privileged and perhaps spoilt Aline, played by Janet Leigh.
Charming. Charming. You dance delightfully. You sing too, no doubt.
A little, sir.
And you play some instrument?
The clavichord.
And I imagine you are skillful with needle and thread.
Oh, yes, sir, I knit and sew. I also embroider, here and there. I have read the plays of Corneille, Racine, Molière, and Voltaire. I do not understand a word of them. I write a little and fall off a lot. I don't cook too well, but I'm quite good at chess, although I prefer snakes and ladders. I have a nodding acquaintance with geography, geometry, astronomy, philosophy, and botany. I'm afraid I gave up algebra when I was 12.
The main villain is the Marquis de Maine, played by Mel Ferrer. Handsome and yet driven by his love of Marie Antoinette, played by Nina Foch, to essentially be a murderous assassin, attempting to maintain power in a France which is rapidly approaching revolution. Devilishly handsome as de Maine may be, he is nonetheless the villain of the piece. He is essentially nothing more than an enforcer, a brutal assassin, using his skill with the blade to assassinate anyone who would dare write against the regime, against Antoinette, her husband, the nobles in power. And indeed, in the nascent People's Assembly, half-stocked by people of the general public and half-stocked by nobles, the Marquis de Maine is slowly assassinating all rivals through the medium of dueling. For those who like to think in terms of Star Wars, it might be helpful to think of the Marquis de Maine as essentially a Darth Vader figure, albeit the complete opposite of horribly disfigured and also suave and charming and with a skillful way with women, and Antoinette as Emperor Palpatine, essentially using him to control his empire, or her empire in this case. Except, in this case, of course, Darth is desperate to get into the pants of Palpy. Okay, this got weird fast. Okay, maybe think of it in terms of Star Wars is not the best way to go. Okay, you get the idea. He's basically her enforcer and hasn't got a breathing problem. Okay. Before launching into the first fight, there are a couple of aspects of the cinematography I'd like to talk about briefly. One is that the original concept for this film was to be a vehicle for Gene Kelly and was going to be a musical. And I, for one, am very glad that this was never the way that it went. Although initially the film has a very light character, and in fact the central character of Andre Moreau is such a feckless, woman-chasing, largely amoral character that it's almost difficult to be sympathetic or empathetic towards him, at least in the typical hero role. And it seems almost unbearably light up until a dramatic change where his friend and almost younger brother in his mind, Philippe, is killed by the aforementioned Marquis de Maine.
Andre! Well, I've heard of the bridegroom running for cover at the last minute, but never the best man. What happened?
They found out I wrote this.
Liberty, Equality, Fraternity by Marcus Brutus.
That's me. I'm Marcus Brutus. There are copies like this all over Paris. We even smuggled a couple into the royal bedchamber.
We?
Thousands of us, Father. United against the aristocratic tyrants.
I take it aristocratic tyrants include your own father and mother?
At this point, the film takes a rapid change in direction, in terms of his character of Andre Moreau, anyway. And although he still maintains some of his devil-may-care, laughing at the insanity of the world characteristics, there is suddenly a steel to him, a harder edge to his character, whenever the Marquis de Maine appears, or he gets an opportunity, he thinks, to get close to having his vengeance upon this man who assassinated essentially his younger brother. But without further ado, let's get to the first fight. The first fight scene occurs almost within the opening titles, certainly immediately thereafter. There's a brief high-speed horse ride by a group who are clearly soldiers, who it turns out are searching for the Marquis de Maine.
Well,
Come on, where is he? Name of the Queen.
The fight is interesting, it being two duels in quick succession by the look of it, although there's no on-screen explanation given. Later context from the film suggests that he was dueling with probably two representatives from the People's Assembly, one of which he dispatches quite quickly, and then he moves on to his second fight, but is then interrupted. The swords initially look like foils, but they are in fact small swords, but small swords of the latter part of the 18th century, as opposed to, for example, in Captain Blood, where they are small swords of the latter part of the 17th century. So they look different, mainly because of the guards and the handles to a degree. The guards on the 17th century small swords from Captain Blood were larger, more cup-like, covering more of the hand, and in fact looked more like the rapier guards that you would then see in the mid-17th century in Cyrano de Bergerac, for example. By this point, the guards in the latter part of the 18th century have developed still further, and they are very small. In fact, in size, they more closely resemble foil guards, although far more ornate and shaped than a sporting foil guard from today. The size of them barely protects the hand at all. They do have some additional features. They tend to have a finger guard wrapping around the handle to protect the fingers from cuts, which is more reminiscent of a sporting saber. And the fight itself, being small sword, is a strange combination of both épée-like point attacks and saber-like cutting actions. There's clearly enough of an edge on these blades, which again have a similar cross-section to modern épée blades, that slashing attacks have some effectiveness, although in this first fight you can see the slashes are made largely with the tip slashing across the opponent's chest, cutting open his clothing, rather than hacking hacking to take off an arm or a leg. And of course, the most effective and destructive attacks are made with the point, with thrusts, as we see with the way he first injures and then finally dispatches his first opponent. The Marquis de Man is played by Mel Ferrer, and it is interesting to contrast what Mel Ferrer said about his fencing in the film and what Stuart Granger said about his fencing within the film, and indeed what they said about each other. Mel Ferrer claimed that he was not a fencer and had never learnt to stage fight with swords at all, and he got around this problem, both in confidence and in technique, by treating it as a dance, because in fact he was trained as a professional dancer, and so he learnt every sequence as if it was a dance sequence, which leads to two odd things. They are incredibly well executed, but occasionally they do look a little bit overly flamboyant. So they are really well timed, but the actions, particularly in that first fight, look a little extravagant. The slashes and the cuts, sometimes coming from the whole arm, which doesn't quite chime with the character of Marquis de Man, or at least the fencing of the Marquis de Man, who's supposed to be a very precise, deadly swordsman, whereas some of these actions look a little bit on the wild side. However, the second fight that he launches into does demonstrate that when taught the sequence and taught to do it in a small, confined way, his fencing looks incredibly professional. The footwork's excellent, the blade work can be brilliant. He obviously had a great sense of his own body position and a great sense of grace and fluidity, and in fact the dancing almost comes through most obviously as he skips from having killed the first man to joining the second man for his second duel. As he dances across the lawn to take his second duel, you can see the dancer in his movements there. He does not move like a normal human being. Conversely, Mel Ferrer said that Stuart Granger was a much better swordsman and had obviously been trained to stage fight in England, and said all these English actors, they have an advantage because they've been trained properly to stage fight, whereas we American actors have not. Stuart Granger, on the other hand, said Mel Ferrer was the expert swordsman and he had been trained more, and that Stuart Granger did not know how to fence at all. Now, Stuart Granger is definitely underplaying his own fencing prowess here. He definitely does know what he's doing, although early on his character has no skills, and we'll see that later on. That said, both of them in their own way are very skilled physical actors, and as such put on very convincing performances throughout all the sword fights in this movie, with the appropriate adjustments for their temperament in any given sword fight and their skill level, which changes in the case of Andre Moreau throughout the film. This second fight marks the major turning point in the tone, although a darker element had been hinted at from the very beginning, with the initial scene of the Marquis de Man butchering one man and eagerly pursuing presumably the same goal with the second. But until now, all we have seen of Andre Moreau was his general foolery and casual attitude to life, relationships, and everyone around him. But in this fight, with the death of essentially his younger brother, everything changes. This fight serves as a perfect illustration of the way power was being maintained by the nobility through dueling and the use of weapons. Only the nobility could afford to be trained to a high level of skill with swords, or those who worked in the military. And indeed, those in the military that would acquire advanced training in swordsmanship would themselves normally be officers, and at this period, officers usually had paid for their commission, so even those people with knowledge of swordplay would themselves be from a wealthy background, even if they were not technically nobility. And this superior training and ability with swords became a mechanism whereby they could retain power by simply provoking duels or threatening duels with those who opposed them, since dueling was still by and large allowed at this time in France. And we see in this fight that nobility alone was no guarantee of competency or training with a weapon either. It was an expensive business to hire a professional trainer for an extended period of time. And Philippe's family, while technically nobility, were clearly nobility who had fallen upon hard times, or harder times anyway. They clearly had not as much money or as much land as other nobles, and were living really as people among the people, but with clearly little money to spare for fencing lessons for Philippe. As we'll see later, Andre Moreau, as someone even further removed from nobility, at least as far as we know up to this point, having essentially been adopted by Philippe's family and looked after, knowing that he was the illegitimate son of somebody, but having no idea who that person was, he had no access to fencing training, and we'll see that very shortly.
Tell Father I didn't dishonor his sword after all.
Philippe! If you have a shred of honor left, you'll stop this fight. It's murder.
Murder?
Want the best swordsman in France against a callow boy?
Well, a blow was struck.
The blow is provoked and you know it. Provoked in cold blood.
Well, it won't be long now. Domain is the ultimate swordsman, you know. No rival, no peer. He practices daily with his private instructor, the great Touterval of Dijon.
Philippe, Andre.
Philippe is clearly outmatched. He makes an unforced error very early on where he falls over, losing his footing in the dirt, and this just further underscores how far outmatched he is by the Marquis de Man. The Marquis de Man is, again, dancing around him, always sure-footed. At one point he leaps upon the table and just continues fighting as if it was nothing. Meanwhile, Philippe vaults the table in a less than graceful action, and again, his footing is never sure. His blade work is poorly positioned. His hand position drifts into the center of his body, leaves him exposed on both sides. His actions are far larger and wider. His parries look poorly placed and again quite wild. All the while, the Marquis de Man is essentially playing with him. He's smiling and he's cruel. When he pins his shirt to the tree and Philippe pretends to remove the sword, the Marquis de Man then whips the sword out of his hand, cutting it, and all the while smiling at Philippe's clear inferiority with the swordplay and smiling at the obvious outcome of this duel. For all the Marquis de Man's charms, there is clearly something the sadist about this man, and he makes the perfect villain for the superficially carefree André Moreau, but who clearly uses this carefree facade to hide a deeper character within, one who does care for his adopted family and does care for those around him who he feels needs his help and support. Not just Philippe, not just Philippe's parents, but also Aline, as it turns out later on. The third fight in the film, following on directly from the second, marks again this fundamental turning point in the entire film, where André Moreau's character undergoes this massive shift in his perspective on life as he becomes driven by fury and a desire for vengeance against the Marquis de Man.
You should have learned how to use a sword before you turned traitor. Pick it up. You shall die with it in your hand. Yes, you're going to die, but not by a bullet. You're going to die as he died, by the sword. You'll be driven back step by step until you stand helpless as he did. And then I, André Moreau, will kill you as you killed him.
The fight choreography here expertly demonstrates the disparity between the swordsmanship in the two characters. André Moreau has clearly had no training and in his fury is just hacking and swatting at the Marquis de Man, who easily bats away every assault until eventually he disarms him, not once but twice. At this point, when the Marquis de Man demands that André Moreau recover his weapon again, we get a nice glimpse of the moral ambiguity that still exists in André Moreau's character. He does not feel as constrained by the nobility, by de Man, or certainly his deceased friend Philippe, to abide by the rules of combat and of dueling. When he sees that there is a pistol near his fallen weapon, he picks it up, and there's a definite impression given that he could very well just use the pistol and unload it into the Marquis de Man where he stands. But that is not the decision he ultimately comes to. He decides to make his escape in order to come back and kill de Man in the same way that he killed Philippe. The next 3 fight scenes all arise from André Moreau's search for Doutreval of Dijon, who is the fencing instructor to the Marquis de Man. This snippet of information was let slip by de Man's henchman, Chabrelain, when he was boasting about Domain's fencing prowess and how he acquired it by practicing daily with his instructor, Doutreval of Dijon. So let's quickly run through each of the scenes in order. First, André Moreau finds Doutreval's training salle and sees that Domain himself is being trained at that very moment. The second scene is obviously André Moreau's very first, or very nearly his very first, fencing lesson with Doutreval.
Think of this. The sword is like a bird. If you clutch it too tightly, you choke it. Too lightly, and it flies away. Now, all actions in fencing are made only with the finger, never with the wrist.
And finally, we have a later lesson where he's clearly learned some techniques in fencing, but still has much to master.
Once more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Very good. Now this time, faster. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Faster. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Very good. Ha-ha-la. You remember what I said when we first started about the little bird? Hold it too tightly, and you choke it. Too lightly, it will fly away. Once again. Ah!
The training scenes, in particular, remind me of aspects of my own fencing training from the very beginning. My first instructor, who had me from being an absolute beginner up to the first 7 years of me learning to fence, was Ákos Moldaványi. Ákos was Hungarian, born in Transylvania, which at the time, 1916, was part of Hungary. Very soon after, in 1918, at the end of the First World War, with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Transylvania was then ceded to Romania, but presumably Ákos and his family must have moved to the main part of Hungary, I think probably Budapest, since Ákos was Hungarian his entire life until he moved to the United Kingdom to become a fencing instructor there in the 1950s after the Soviet crackdown in Hungary. The first thing which reminded me of Ákos was the quote about holding the sword as if it was a bird. Hold it too tightly and you'll crush it. Hold it too loosely, it'll fly away. And Ákos used that exact same phrase with me and others when training them to fence, which makes me wonder if, one, he had actually read Scaramouche or seen the film and acquired it from that, or if it's something that was well known and built into fencing training for decades, if not centuries, and even predates Ákos and Sabatini's novel itself. The novel Scaramouche was written in 1921, when Ákos would have been 5. I'm not entirely sure when Ákos started his fencing training. It was obviously quite early in his life. He became proficient very quickly. He presided over the last official duel in Europe, which was between the wars, between the First and Second World War, when he was serving in the army at the time as a fencing instructor. And there was apparently a dispute between 2 farmers about the amount of mud that was attached to potatoes. Anyway, the details I will not go into right now, but the point is, he would have grown up with the novel available, so it is intriguing to wonder whether or not Sabatini supplied him with this piece of fencing advice, which he then imparted to his pupils, or if Sabatini himself had picked this up from fencing instructors, and this was something in common currency amongst instructors throughout history. As I said, Ákos was my instructor from year 0 of my fencing up to the 7th year, and he did train me initially in all 3 weapons. Well, initially in foil, then after about a year I had tried out saber and épée and was at that point training with all 3 weapons with a mind to deciding which one I actually wanted to fence with a focus. The part of the second instruction scene which reminded me of Ákos's lessons were the sequence of saber cuts that Doutreval is making Moreau go through and speeding up the sequence as it progresses. Ákos trained me in a very similar similar way with a sequence of cuts, parries, ripostes to different lines in a set sequence which would then be sped up to get the movements more fluid and more efficient and effective. And it is eerily familiar watching Andre Moreau being trained in the same way. Even the sounds that Dutraval makes are not dissimilar to the sounds that Akos used to make when he throws the blade away. Akos used to go when he was doing different actions in different lines, changing lines. It's very authentic as far as I can tell. This instruction scene was either written brilliantly by Sabatini, or the fight choreographers and the filmmakers clearly got a lot of inspiration from actual fencing instruction and fencing training techniques and the habits and the tics of fencing masters. One final point. Of course, I ended up fencing épée, but the saber, which I used for illustration earlier in this film, is actually Akos's saber, and I am honoured to still have it and to look after it. Obviously, he was already very old when he first started to train me in 1992. He would already have been 76, and when he finished training me in 99 and retired, he was already 83. And sadly, Akos Moldavani died in 2011 at the ripe old age of 95. But he had a good life, and he influenced and touched the lives of many people, and I will always fondly look after it, saber, as one of the mementos of all those invaluable lessons he taught me. And now we come to the 7th fight scene in Scaramouche, and one of the most important and longer fights in the entire film, and certainly a pivotal point in the plot. For Andre Moreau, the dangers of taking Demand's instructor as his own come home to roost.
Dutraval, how long have you been teaching the traitor Andre Moreau to fence?
Well, you never heard of Andre Moreau. The fool imagines he's been instructing Montgomery of Lorraine, an artillery officer. Yeah, take your money, idiot. Ask more questions next time.
Actually, you've done me a great service.
Hand him his sword, Dutraval. Get out.
And now, Moreau, for your final lesson.
My compliments. You've learned a few tricks since our last meeting. You'd at least be a match for our young friend Marcus Brutus if he were still with us. You might even defeat him. But no, the main is perhaps another matter. See, it takes time to make a swordsman. Time and patience and practice. One cannot expect to acquire overnight what others have learned only by years of endeavor. For instance, the double 1, 2, 3. The bind triple. The feint of disengagement, coupe. The feint of disengagement, double. And
Andre.
Leave.
take him.
To jump briefly back into Star Wars mode again, this is Andre Moreau's Empire moment, where he faces his nemesis before he's ready. Before combat begins, he cleverly protects Dutreval from any consequences by inventing a story that he'd told Dutreval that he was a military officer by a different name, and as such, Dutreval hopefully escapes any consequences or reprisal from Duman himself. But Andre Moreau cannot disguise himself, and he cannot escape Duman's desire to crush his impudence and see him removed as a threat. Moreau's fencing veers between competency and desperation, much as you might expect from an intermediate fencer. All the while, Duman is schooling him. Ultimately, he does not lose a hand, but is only saved by the intervention of both Aline and Dutreval. Stuart Granger, quite famously, did almost all of his own stunts. The horse riding you see at the beginning, all the sword fighting you see, and much of the physical acrobatic work involved in the fight scenes. As such, he had many tales of mishaps in the production of many films, and Scaramouche is no exception. In this scene, we see Duman position Moreau underneath a giant iron chandelier, and then, of course, cut it free, in the hope that it will crush Andre Moreau underneath. The shot is still in the film, but the director had a more ambitious idea for the shot in mind, as is recounted in this interview for the BBC TV programme Wogan.
Do you have many mishaps doing that? Many a sword?
Well, yeah, I got a sword in the mouth for that. Oh. But the worst one was Scaramouche, actually. Did you ever see Scaramouche?
Yes, severely.
Scaramouche. There was a time when there was a scene where there was an enormous chandelier, and Mel Ferrer, I don't know how to fence, and Mel Ferrer is fencing madly, and he trips me and I fall, and then the chandelier comes down and I roll out, you see. So they go to the time when I trip and I fall, and the chandelier starts, and they cut, and I go to my dressing room, recover from the energy, and then I come back, and the director says, "Jim, I got a wonderful shot."
Jim?
He says, "Jimmy, my name's Jimmy."
Huh?
You didn't know my name's Jimmy.
I did, but they might.
Oh, then I know, and I'm name is Jimmy. James Stewart. I was born James Stewart, and there was a fellow there before me, so I had to change it to Granger. And anyway, he says, the lovely shot, because you see this hole in the ground, the camera's in the ground, you see, you're lying in the front. And we see, with the camera, we see your face, and we see this chandelier come, ooh, like that, and stop, you see. Wonderful shot. And I said, supposing it doesn't stop? And he said, Jim, come on. He says, MGM, for Christ's sake, man, we do this all the time. I said, I'd like to see it. And they said, oh, Christ, these actors, it takes so much time to, I damn that he did it. This is being difficult, I damn that he did it. And said, oh, well, I'll be a good guy and do it. And I said, no, I want to see it. Oh, well, all right. This bored look came over their face. All right, let it go, Cyril. The special effects name was Cyril. And he let it go, and he went, hey, boom! That much into solid wood. Because it was one of those old iron things with a scalloping solid wood. It was a mattress I'd been lying on, which was absolute, it was a hamburger. I'd have been wiped out. And I was sort of shaking like that. And there was no sound. There was a deathly silence except for the sobbing of Cyril. Oh, my God, it's never happened before. And the director was throwing up. And then I said, yes, interesting. And I walked to my dressing room. And then I threw up.
It is incredible to think how close the film came to killing its leading actor. There was also mention at the beginning of that clip of another incident which I believe also occurred in Scaramouche, but unfortunately many of the interviews that I'd seen from Stuart Granger from many years ago, often when I was a child, don't seem to be readily available on the internet or easily searchable on YouTube. But I also remember other stories about this film, and there was a slight allusion to it at the beginning of the Wogan clip, where he talks about getting a sword in the mouth, and I'll come back to that at a later point. The eighth fight scene in Scaramouche occurs after Dutreval has rescued Andre Moreau from Duman's henchmen, and they both realize that Moreau can no longer get instruction from Dutreval. It would be too dangerous, Dutreval would likely be watched, and initially it seems as though Moreau's training is at an end. Then Dutreval mentions in passing his old instructor, at which point Moreau asks, is he still alive? And it transpires that he is. And so Moreau then leaps upon the idea of going to Paris with the acting troupe he's now hiding in as the character of Scaramouche, in order to get training from Perigord, the very man who trained Dutreval, who in turn trained Duman.
Enough. Enough. You seem to have forgotten everything I taught you. This is no lesson. You make it a street fight. He could have run you through a dozen times.
What time is it?
It's 6 o'clock.
Well, we still got 30 minutes. Come on, again.
The head. Fight with the head. Forget the heart. That's enough for today. Go home.
Thank you.
Huh. You have a demon in you this fine day. Lose it, or you'll not live to see another.
Yes, you're right.
The scene opens with somebody spying on the training session between Perigord, Moreau, and his sparring partner. We later find out that this is a member of the People's Assembly, and he's looking to find a champion to join the Assembly to essentially defeat the nobles, particularly Domain, who are eliminating the people's representatives slowly through dueling, and so they want someone who is as skilled as the nobles in order to fight them. This is something we learn after this fight scene. In the scene itself, Andre Moreau is clearly annoyed, frustrated, and unable to control his emotions fully for this training session, and gets rightly berated for it by Perigord. The next two fights, 9 and 10 in the film, occur after Andre Moreau has been persuaded by the representative from the People's Assembly to join the People's Assembly, replacing a member who had already been essentially assassinated by Domain. As a member of the Assembly, he is now immune to prosecution for his perceived treachery with the pamphlet distribution, etc., that ultimately caused the death of Philippe. Moreau, on the other hand, is hoping that Domain will be there so that he can provoke a duel, or that a duel will be provoked by Domain, and he can finally get his vengeance. However, the two women in his life, Lenore and Aline, have formed an unlikely partnership in attempting to prevent Andre Moreau from meeting Domain. Through the medium of the Queen, Marie Antoinette, Aline has arranged various inconvenient meetings for Domain that means he cannot attend the People's Assembly. However, other representatives from the nobility do challenge Andre Moreau to duels, and two of these form the next two fight scenes.
6.
Your face revolts me. Your eyes are pig's eyes, and your ears are the most...
All right.
Behind the cathedral at 6.
The fight scenes are shot in the mist and at a distance, and it is difficult to tell even if the actors are involved in the fight or if it is simply the fight coordinators or other fencers who are taking on the role in these particular scenes. The scenes do look, for all their brevity, very convincing dueling scenes. The first of them actually has a death blow or a final blow being delivered, and it's done at quite a long distance. This fight resembles épée quite strongly in the way it is conducted, and with the actions being conducted at quite a long distance. The second fight is just as short and may indeed simply have been shot at exactly the same time and be an extension of a longer sequence that they cut into two fight scenes to represent the two duels. And so we come to the final climactic battle of the film.
Andre Moreau.
Scaramouche, you have given your last performance.
Why don't you come and take it?
There is considerable back and forth in this fight, and initially, Duman appears to have the upper hand completely. He forces Andre Moreau back very quickly, has him pinned over the edge of the balcony, but midway through, the tides turn. In fact, where on the stairs, Duman suddenly is forced to lose his footing and falls down the stairs, and from that moment onwards, his confidence appears broken, whereas Moreau's is bolstered, and he realizes that he either has both the stamina and the skills to match and exceed the Marquis de Man. As mentioned previously, the main actors did their own stunts, and the agility is incredible, both on the balcony scenes where Stuart Granger is falling and leaping around and losing his balance, but all the time, of course, in a controlled way from an acting standpoint, because he is performing these losses of equilibrium, to this scene in the main seating area of the theatre where they're leaping across the chair backs and running across the backs of the chairs, and this is where another incident occurred with Stuart Granger. You can see where at one point he's straddling across two rows of chair backs, and you can actually see from one angle it's obvious that the chair backs are up in the more modern sprung theatre seating style. From another angle they're all forced down to look more authentic for a late 18th century theatre where the seats were not necessarily able to swing up and down. Nevertheless, they are really modern theatre seats, and as such, during the shooting of one of these seat back fighting sequences, Stuart Granger's leg slipped down between the seat of the chair and the back of the chair, and the first time I heard this it was told as if he'd broken his leg. In fact, all that had happened was that he popped his knee out. I mean, he caused quite a severe injury to his leg by doing this. And yet, basically, they iced it up, they wrapped it up, and for the second half of the sequence, or a large part of the shooting of the second half of the sequence, he actually has bandages wrapped around his knee underneath his leggings, but it is well done such that you can't see this. And it is here that another incident comes to mind, and where I'm now forced to rely upon my memory because I can't find the footage of the interviews where it was talked about. This particular accident may or may not have occurred in Scaramouche. It may have occurred in The Prisoner of Zenda, but in my mind I've certainly got it conflated with his account of Mel Ferrer being, while excellent with a sword, as he often says of Mel Ferrer, despite Mel Ferrer saying he knew nothing, he said that Mel Ferrer had a habit of being distracted whenever a beautiful woman walked into the room, and so mishaps happened as a consequence of Mel Ferrer being distracted. Connected with this in my mind is the tale of Stuart Granger told where he got stabbed in the mouth. He basically was meant to be stabbed at towards the head and move his head one side, and then a second attempt was made to stab him in the head and he moved to the other side. But Stuart Granger forgot to do the second move to one side, and the sword went straight into his mouth. Now, as it happened, the sword point went down the side of his gum next to his teeth, rattling, if you like, along his teeth, making a horrible sound to his account. Both he and the person, I'm going to pretend for now it's Mel Ferrer, stood transfixed transfixed for a moment, and then the sword was withdrawn, and with it a massive gout of blood came out, and everyone was in a panic because they assumed he'd been run through the back of the head. As it happened, the wound was largely superficial, was entirely superficial. It had basically just cut the gum, and of course the gum bleeds very profusely. So when the sword was withdrawn, a lot of spittle and blood just came out in a gush, but luckily the injury was minor, and he was able to continue almost immediately after having it sort of mopped up and once the bleeding had stopped. However, this tale plus the previous tale of his leg and the tale of the crashing chandelier all show how committed they were to the physical aspects of the acting, the physical aspects of representing what their characters were doing in the film. And both Mel Ferrer and Stuart Granger really demonstrate to a high degree in this final fight scene how good they were as physical actors acting out the fights to the best and the very limits of their ability and strengths. The fight itself has some beautiful moments. Again, there is a mirroring of wounds. The wounds that Daman had exacted upon Andre Moreau in the earlier fight where Andre Moreau was not ready to take on Daman is reminiscent, of course, occurred before, of the fight in The Princess Bride where Inigo Montoya mirrors the wounds inflicted on him by the Six-Fingered Man. There is another classic instance of returning the weapon to his opponent, rather like Errol Flynn in The Adventures of Robin Hood returns the weapon to Guy of Gisborne. And finally, he does drive Daman back and back until he's up against the wall and is basically in a position where he could kill him. And yet he does not. And the reason for this becomes clear after he has abandoned the fight. He cannot kill him because of another Star Wars moment, if you like, where it is revealed that the Marquis de Man is his father. But wait, how can... Shut up! Sorry. No, not that Marquis de Man is his father. The father of the Marquis de Man, the old Marquis de Man, was also Andre Moreau's father, and in fact that was where his stipend was coming from, via the friend of the father, Marquis de Man, who was the Duke of Gavrillac. So, the current Marquis de Man turns out to be Andre Moreau's older brother, and somehow he recognizes that at the last moment and cannot kill him. And so we have reached the end of our review of all the fights in Scaramouche. I want to try and wrap this up as quickly as possible, as I suspect I've probably gone over length based upon past experience and the sheer number of fights in this film. I will just wrap up by saying that Andre Moreau gets the girl, although I have to say, in my opinion, he gets the wrong girl. He chooses Aline over Lenore. And let's face it, Lenore is hot. She's both fiery in personality and fiery of hair. She's incredibly beautiful and sexy, whereas Aline is a more tiny, fragile China doll by comparison, and in personality a lot less interesting, in my opinion. But of course, each to their own. The strength of this film is beginning to solidify an opinion I've been forming, that it increases the chances of producing a good film if you base it upon a good piece of literature, be it a novel or a play. Of the films reviewed so far, all but one of them have been based on a novel or a play. Now, of course, that's no guarantee of quality. You can still produce a terrible film based upon a novel, for example, Battlefield Earth. However, I do think a well-crafted novel will give you a story that will be transferable to film if it's done skillfully, but we shall see how this theory continues with the future videos. So, just to round off this video, I think I should apologize to my French friends and frenemies for my atrocious and inconsistent pronunciation of French names. You could look on it as a sort of an international homage to Law Reloaded. That said, I hope you enjoyed this, number 6 in the top 10 best sword fighting films of all time, and I hope you will join me for 1, the magnificent musical mayhem of the Yamaha CP20 when I get it out, and also join me for the next in the exciting series of the best sword fighting films of all time, number 5. Take care.